Welcome to the Financial Leaders Network. I'm your host, Alec Borland, and in today's episode, I'm joined by Melissa Schoger. Melissa not only has achieved financial leadership status, but she's also been the company leader and president for a $500 million business unit of a publicly traded company. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, tea, adult beverage if it's that time of the day, and enjoy. So, Melissa, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you, Alec. Glad to be
Of
here.
course. Yeah. So, just to kick things off for us, then, why don't you, walk us through your path to becoming not only a financial leader, but also a business unit leader?
Yes, of course. Well, I took a less traditional path, I would say, to being a finance leader in that I did not go to the Big Four out of college. I actually went to work directly into industry at RPM International. It's a paints and coatings company here in Cleveland, and went into internal audit. And I was blessed or cursed, depending on your perspective, that Sarbanes-Oxley was passed pretty much right after I graduated. So most of my internal audit career was focused around Sarbanes-Oxley documentation, implementation, testing.
Yeah.
What it did do, though, is really give me a solid background in process and how things actually work, not how the textbooks say things happen.
Yeah.
So it was a really good foundation for me, I think, to to really understand the processes and get to know in detail, AR, AP, credit, inventory controls, and things like that.
Yeah.
But then it became a bit too much like Groundhog's Day, and I
Yeah.
was I was blessed that RPM gave me the opportunity then to go and work for the controller and treasurer at the time, where I was able to get exposure to actually the more day-to-day month-end close type processes. I worked on a month-end close for the RPM corporate headquarters, and also talk about being thrown into the fire. The SEC reporting manager went on maternity leave during our year-end close.
Okay.
So they asked me to step in and help run pulling together the K and the annual report.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously I had a lot of support, but that was quite the experience, obviously.
Yeah.
And in that role, I also worked on treasury functions, helped with, reviewing debt covenants. I was able to sit in on bank meetings. I also did some investor relations meetings.
Mm.
And RPM has a big, actually, individual investor base. So we went to investor shows. I went myself with the director of investor relations, and we talked about RPM. And again, that was really interesting as well, even just walking around and seeing the other businesses that were there.
Yeah. And this is all still early stages.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Wow. Right.
And then I got the opportunity to move to Belgium, and which is where RPM's European headquarters is. And I helped to implement a cash pooling system while I was there. And much to the chagrin of all the Europeans, we chose Bank of America. It's because everybody wanted their own country's bank, right?
Sure.
But in that, I got to really work with the bank on the implementation as well as rolling it out to all of our units, and also worked with our treasurer to invest any excess funds that we had, determining how much we thought there would be based on estimated cash outflows, and determining whether we should do overnight borrowings versus a longer term borrowing.
Okay.
And then when I came back, that's when I went into the FP&A function. I came back and went to work for the VP of FP&A at RPM at the time, who actually worked for the COO, not the CFO, which is a little unusual. So it
Yeah.
went up through the COO at RPM at the time.
Interesting.
And so, well, it really was good in that it gave, again, a different perspective, not a purely financial perspective on
Yeah.
business decisions. So I really learned a lot in that. And I advanced up to ultimately becoming the VP of FP&A for RPM in that role, where I was responsible for our capital allocations, running the annual operating plan meetings, as well as our what we called our growth and strategy meetings, which were the long-term strategy meetings.
Okay.
And I also was responsible for presenting the annual plan to the board at that time when I was VP. So
Okay.
great opportunity, exposure to the board as well
Yeah.
as executive leadership. So it was a great role.
When you were in that role, were you still reporting to the COO, or did that structure
I
change?
was. No, I did report to the COO. It changed after I moved out. So,
Got it.
yeah, but I did report to the COO the whole time.
Okay. Interesting. Now, with all those projects, as you're moving up the RPM ladder, like were those projects that you sought out, or was it one of those where you're getting tapped on the shoulder? Like Melissa's knocking this out. Let's see if she's got bandwidth to put it on her plate.
It was a little bit of both, I would say. I don't think anybody actually expected me to volunteer to move to Belgium, but
Yeah.
we I was married but didn't have kids at the time yet, so it was pretty easy. My husband worked at Ernst and Young, so he was able to transfer and work from their Brussels office as well. So it actually, it worked out really well.
Yeah. Okay.
And then part of the coming back and going into FP&A is that we were ready to move home. Belgium's great. It's one of my favorite countries, but we were ready to move home for sure. So
Yeah. Okay. So when you moved back, that's when you stepped into the FP&A side of things, right? And that's when you went up from director
mhm.
to VP. Okay.
Yes, correct. So it was a career progression. The gentleman who had been my boss, the VP of FP&A, became the CFO at RPM. So
Okay.
that's why the position opened.
Fair enough. That works out well.
Yes, yes, definitely. And then RPM decided while I was in the VP of FP&A role, and I was really involved in the whole process, but we embarked on what we called MAP 2020, which was a margin
Okay.
acceleration plan. It was talked about when we went to work on it. And it was really about, RPM is a great home for entrepreneurs. It always has been.
Mm.
And it's very decentralized, which is fantastic, obviously, and it really helps generate the growth that RPM continually sees. But it's pretty inefficient from a background standpoint, having plants and warehouses close together that are doing fundamentally the same thing. So
Okay.
that project is really what took me to Germany, back to Europe, this time with kids.
Okay.
And and it was really I was there. I was the president of the European division of the Tremco Construction Products Group. So I was responsible for 25 countries, multiple manufacturing sites, the full P&L. So I had R&D, HR, IT, all of that, sales
Mm.
and marketing, all reporting to me. So I was running the business while also doing this business transformation project.
Okay.
So, and COVID hit while we were living there as well. So
Nice little cherry on top.
yes, so that made it even more fun, I would say, because the in-person support that I was getting from my boss obviously went away because he was still in Cleveland, and
Yeah.
Zoom and Teams is great, but to a certain extent, yeah. As
Yeah.
well as my teams that were all over Europe, and we were actually able to close and consolidate 2 manufacturing facilities during COVID without people actually being able to get on the ground and do it.
Okay.
Like from the other, from the transferring site. So it
Yeah.
was
How do you
success.
manage that? What are the keys to managing projects like that?
It was really a lot of time on calls, and for the entire business, I actually started doing at the request of, some of our marketing team. I started doing monthly updates where I was able to not just talk about what was going on in the business, help maybe feel people feel less isolated, but also be able to call out and recognize people that were doing great work at the time.
Okay.
Uh, but lots and lots of calls, Zoom calls. I mean, it
Yeah.
was nonstop,
So
nonstop.
So communication, keeping the lines open, making sure people know where the project's at, and
Yes.
that probably helps you get ahead of certain issues and
Yes.
not find out the hard way.
Yes. Well, it also taught me the hard, balance between, how much, too much and too little communication, right? Because,
Mm. Yeah,
certain projects are sensitive, right? And while people want to know what's going on, you can't necessarily talk about it. So finding a way to, give as much information as possible. I've learned that no amount of communication is enough, right? You can never do too much.
right.
So,
Yeah. Okay. So you were in the process of running that business. You said you were also responsible for closing some of those plants or some of
mhm.
those locations. What when you originally stepped into that role, going from, VP of FP&A of this was probably like one and a half, not $2 billion company at the time. What were the biggest transitional pain points, if you will, in stepping from that VP FP&A role to a president type of role?
I would say one of the biggest was coming from corporate, people didn't trust me. I mean, fundamentally,
Okay.
they thought I was, the corporate watchdog coming to, wreck their world.
Okay.
So, going back to one of the things that I think is important in anybody's career, it's really taking the time to develop relationships and lean on those relationships that you already have
Yeah.
to bring other people along. And I think that is really vital in any role, but I would say particularly in an FP&A role or a finance role because people tend to view you as, the person who's always saying no.
Right. Yeah.
And so really using those relationships to try to move things forward by also leveraging not just developing new relationships, but leveraging the ones that I already had in existence. And I had some people on my leadership team that I had a pretty good existing working relationship with just from my FP&A role. So that really helped with that transition.
Yep.
But I would say for me, because I had been involved with operations because I was responsible for the CapEx. And so I was, familiar with R&D to an extent as well because of their capital needs.
Yep.
But the most difficult transition for me as a finance person was the sales and marketing
Mm.
mindset because it's totally different than in
Yeah.
ops or even in R&D because ops R&D and finance are very structured, I would say,
Right.
whereas the sales team just has a totally different thought process. Not that it's not structured; it's just a different structure than perhaps
Yeah.
finance would be used to. So, I was lucky enough to have a good, actually a great VP of sales and marketing who really helped me, work through those challenges and understand that perspective of the business
Mm.
and also help bring that team along with the changes that we were making.
Yeah. I love that. I've 2 follow-up questions to those points. One is, I think it's one that not as many people ask. It's a very basic question, but some people are naturally better at building and maintaining those relationships inside a company, especially when we're talking about accounting and finance professionals. I know because I interview about 10 to 15 of them a week, right? And you have people like yourself who are very easy to talk to, very like they kind of understand that in order to grow, you need to build those relationships with people in different functions and understand how the business operates. Do you have any advice for people who aren't naturally great at building those relationships internally and maybe just like some practical steps to make it a little bit easier for them to do so?
I would say it really came in baby steps for me because I am naturally an introvert. And, but I realized if I wanted to advance in my career, you know, a wallflower doesn't advance very far, right?
Correct.
So in small steps, either by, you know, spending time with people that I was comfortable with in a group setting where other people that I didn't know as well were there to just get more comfortable speaking with people that I didn't know well or that were from a different part of the business. It was it was a really step-by-step conscious process for me to
Yeah.
put myself out there and start a conversation with somebody that I didn't know.
Yeah.
Uh, So, I mean, I guess my advice would be is just make the conscious effort, even if you're uncomfortable, to talk to people.
It's kinda you gotta force yourself out there, realize you're gonna be okay, and I think worst case scenario, just ask questions, right? Make them do the talking, right?
It
Like,
does,
I
especially, if ask people, what is they I mean, I haven't dated in a while, but,
yeah,
people like to talk about themselves, right? So if
right?
you keep asking questions about them, and then if they in turn ask questions, it's a lot easier, I guess, to respond if somebody's asking you a question instead of trying to make small talk, just
Yeah.
general.
I think the key is just you have to have that genuine curiosity, right? It can't people are gonna know when it's like, "Oh, that's insincere." But I think, like, a lot of people could really benefit from just taking a small percentage of their week and applying it towards building that skill, because if you do wanna advance, like, I can just, from what I see day in, day out, what I have seen day in and day out, those are the people, the ones with those skills are typically the ones who get promoted, the fastest in the roles that people who are very, career conscious that they wanna get to. So it's kind of funny because you mentioned the sales understanding and having a different mindset. It's kind of interlinked, but I guess the comment I had there, the question there is, do you feel like it's the sales mindset it's a little bit more all over the place because it's a little bit more erratic, right? Like there's things that you can't control in a business development in a sales ecosystem, whereas in finance, you're just dealing with numbers and you're dealing with after the fact stuff for the most part, right? We're not talking about forecasting or anything like that. But we're talking about trying to make a sale happen. You can't, there's just so many different variables. And so because of that, you get some gunslingers out there and you get some different, like what they're trying to do in that regard. Does that kind of match up with what you saw?
Yes, definitely,
Yeah.
and that, I really think that, you know, things like Salesforce are actually a great way to provide those of us who are less gunslinger like some form
Yeah.
of process, right? If we have a mechanism to track, what they're doing and how productive their visits are and things like that.
Yes.
So I think that really helped bridge the gap. And we actually implemented Salesforce while I was there because we didn't have
Mm.
a a good, I would say, sales tool that we were using. Well,
Yeah. Yeah, it's a tough one. It's something that,
mhm,
we look at as an organization to make sure that we are being as efficient as possible, but we're trying to align structure to where structure is hard to align. We're trying to put railroad tracks down on something that is on ground that is very hard to kind of get there. Um,
right.
so from there, you ended up moving back to the States, correct? Did you move back with them or was that a different setup?
It was kind of all at the same time because the restructuring project wrapped up, and at that point, my husband and kids had moved back to the States actually because of COVID. The Germans kept closing the schools, and they were very young at that time, and having 2 full-time working parents and trying to wrangle kids onto Zoom sessions, they were not getting a very good education, let's put it that way. So
Sure.
my husband and kids actually moved back before I did, so that was kind of the impetus. I mean, the project was wrapping up and I really needed to get home, and unfortunately, obviously my role, because I had been gone for 3 years, my role, as VP of FP&A had been filled, and
Right.
there just wasn't anything that was of mutual interest, for either myself or RPM at the time.
Uh,
So, we parted very amicably. It was sad. 20 years of my career was at RPM, but,
yeah.
this is the way sometimes, and, that's how I ended up at Avery.
Okay. Got it. And then with your role at Avery, that was originally more back into your finance toolkit, correct?
I had a small stint where I was a GM, but then I pretty quickly transitioned, I would say less than 6 months, into the VP of, finance role.
Got it. So with both of these experiences, big companies, are they both publicly traded, right?
They are both publicly traded,
Right.
yes.
Both publicly traded. You had a lot of upward mobility. Is there anything that any traits that you see in yourself that have kind of helped you step into these roles and tackle all of these projects, both here in the States and abroad?
I will share what I told somebody else when they asked me why they thought I was successful, somebody who was coming to work for me. And I said, obviously there's has to be a foundation in competence, right? You have to be good at the work, the job.
Right.
But I think if people like you, it goes a long way. So it goes back to the whole relationship developing.
Yeah.
um, that no matter how competent you are, at some point, people have to like you too.
Yeah.
So I think that has made a big difference for me, honestly.
Absolutely. Okay. Interesting. So to dive a little bit deeper then, so in these roles, they're very demanding, right? Like when you are running a business unit, whether from a president seat, a high level finance seat, these are very demanding positions. Walk us through like what a day in the life looks like for you.
Well, it varies obviously, but I would say typically I try to wake up and go for a run. Doesn't always
Okay.
happen. Because my kids get on the bus at 6:30 in the morning now, so that makes for a very
Okay.
early.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, so try to get up and exercise just because it, helps take away stress, clear my brain, wake me up a little bit,
Yep.
and then get the kids to school really early. And then in the Avery role, I was working from home, so I would pretty much, pop down on my computer at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning.
Okay.
I like to spend the first 30 minutes going through emails because, Europe and Asia I had in my purview. So, you know, there's emails from overnight
Yep.
and have my first cup of coffee, hopefully, before the call starts.
Keyword first.
Yes. The
Yep.
first of many cups of coffee before, all the calls start.
Yeah.
And then every day varied, but my kids do play competitive sports. So usually
Okay.
in the evenings, I would try to take a break, get them fed, get them to practice, and then they play hockey. So at least I'm inside, and there's usually Wi-Fi. So I would boot up again and start, check emails, finish up things that I needed to finish up for the day.
Okay.
So that was that's basically a typical day in the life, I would say.
What time is the alarm going off? Because if you're running before and they get on at 6:30, I gotta imagine it's somewhere around 5.
Yeah, it's around 5.
Okay.
But
Before 5?
and if, depending on hockey practice, it can be, yeah, 11 o'clock sometimes before I'm in bed. So
Ooh. Okay.
uh, I try to go to bed earlier than that, but
Mhm.
practices can, now that they're older, can be a little late into the evening. So
Sure. Do you have any kind of wind down routine that's not as popular as the morning routines, but I'm seeing more people talk about those as a way to kind of reset the brain a little bit, tell it to calm down, basically.
yes, I am, because I will say I'm not somebody who can go from running all day to falling asleep instantaneously. So
Yeah.
I like to read or watch a light TV show, maybe
Okay.
have a glass of wine.
Yeah.
I try not to stay up too late, but sometimes, especially if the brain's still going, I can't shut it off right away.
Yeah. Is that gonna be something that is more like fictional or non-fictional when you read?
Fiction, I would say, because sometimes you just need to escape reality a little bit, let's
Yeah.
be honest.
Well, if you were gonna say it was like something, self-help or business, I'm like, okay, well that's interesting. But because people are like, if you just read, it will make you more tired. But whenever I read business books, it's like idea, 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 and then and then I'm even more jacked up.
Well, exactly, because you do start to think about, oh, well, I should try to apply this to this situation that's going on, and it just doesn't help. So, whereas fiction kind of takes you out of all of that and
Yeah.
uh, lets you relax.
Yep. I gotta say, I'm guilty of I'll throw on Netflix and put on the dumbest show that I can find and just
Exactly.
space
Sometimes
out.
you
So
do.
like, yeah,
And I usually fall asleep within 20 minutes. I
yeah,
don't know that I very rarely, it's a big joke in our house because my husband will sit down with me also and he's like, "You never make it through anything." I'm like, "I can't help it." Like as soon as I actually sit, then I end up falling asleep on the couch. But
it's my triggering event. It puts me to sleep. Awesome. So we kind of touched on, when we're talking about work-life balance, it's tough when you have kids at home and when you have a demanding job and then when your kids are getting into sports. Do you have any additional are you making any conscious efforts of how you go about maintaining work-life balance where you can?
I've thought about this a lot because I feel like people focus so much on work-life balance. And I think that for me, it really ebbs and flows. Sometimes there is more work than life, right?
Yeah.
Depending on the time of year. I mean, especially in a finance role, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's inevitable.
It's literally ebbs and flows. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it's really taking advantage of those times when it's ebbing to have more of the life balance, right? And
Mm.
make up for those times when perhaps work came first and somebody else had to take the kids to practice or whatnot, right?
Yeah.
So it's really understanding that it's not always going to be perfect. I mean, it's never in perfect harmony, especially in a finance role. You are
Yeah.
always going to have times when you are just busy and
Yeah.
you can't do anything about it. That's
Yeah.
the choice you make when you get into a finance-based position, right?
Yeah.
So, it's understanding that when there is that ebb is taking that time to slow down and, take a
Yeah.
vacation and try to not look at your phone. That
Yeah.
that is the worst thing is, well, I'll just get up and check
I'll look at
email.
one email. Yeah. And then it's like, "Oh, did I see that? Is there more in there?" Right.
Well, I've made a conscious effort though when I am on vacation. I will look at things, but I have an out of office on. So
Okay.
if it's not urgent, I won't reply. And if it is urgent and somebody else can deal with it, I'll forward it to them.
Mm, I like that. That's a good little area of delegation there. I guess you kind of got into this a little bit earlier, but it sounds like you might batch when you check your emails. So do you have it, like you check it in the morning and then do you close out and then do you have those set times throughout the day?
No, I
Or is it
don't.
kind of
I'm
sporadic?
guilty of, oh, an email popped up and,
Yeah.
no, it's bad. I really should shut it down because honestly, if it's that important, somebody will call you, right? Everybody
Yeah.
has your phone number, everybody can reach you on, the whatever app you're using, at work, be it
Yeah.
Zoom, Teams. So, it's a habit that I should get into, but unfortunately, no.
It's hard because they wired it so it's little dopamine hits for us. They've got us trapped with that little dopamine hit. Yeah. When it comes to work-life balance, I feel like a lot of people are saying that hybrid or working fully remote, it makes it easier. It lets you have better work-life balance. I could see arguments for both sides. What are your thoughts in that regard?
I would say working from home, you end up working more, right? Because like I said, I sit down at my computer, 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, which if I were going into the office,
Yeah.
I wouldn't be doing. And then, I probably don't take a break for lunch or I eat lunch at my desk while I'm working, right? Whereas if you're in an office setting, you socialize, maybe go out to lunch with colleagues, things like that.
Yeah.
But it does provide the flexibility of getting, some things, that are not as hands-on done, like laundry. You can do laundry during the
Yeah.
day.
It's my kid.
So, silly things like that, it helps, but I would say working from home, I tended to end up working more hours because you cut
Yeah.
out commute, right? It's not like I took up that time with something else. I just sat down at the desk.
I think it depends on the person in a large part. And fortunately, most accounting and finance professionals, they're going to be disciplined enough to get done what they need to. I we see right now, it's January 14th, 2025. We see a lot of different return to office mandates, if you will, from some of the bigger companies across the US. We'll see if that trend continues. I still feel like hybrid 3-2 is probably a good sweet spot for accounting and finance specifically. I mean, there's just less and less people in our world, so we have to keep those professionals happy. But at the end of the day, it's company leaders' decisions, and we'll kind of see which route they want to go in that regard.
Personally, having experience, obviously, I've been working for a long time. So I was fully in the office for, up
Mhm.
until COVID.
Yeah.
And then being fully remote at Avery, I would say I agree with you that I think hybrid is best because it's very hard, because to me, relationships are very important. And I found it really hard to develop a relationship when you're getting on a 30-minute call with somebody and it's about a specific topic. Nobody sticks around to chat. You're not passing each other in the hall or meeting at the coffee pot, every
Yeah.
morning. So I think because and it tends to be you end up talking to the same people all the time. You don't get exposure to the different people like you would if you were in the office.
I think those early career professionals too. I think like, sorry, younger generation, but best way to learn is to be around the best and to be able to have those one-off conversations that turn into 30 to 45-minute informal mentoring sessions. It's just you nailed it in the sense of you miss out on those opportunities to build the relationship, to have those discussions around things you would never expect. And I've seen it. I worked fully remote, for like a year and a half, and, when I was with my team originally in person, I thank God that I got the time with them that I did because when we were remote, it's not this you again, it's just not the same.
It's not. And I cannot imagine starting a career fully remote. I just can't even. And to me, it seems like it would be harder to advance because your exposure to different people is so limited
Right.
when you're fully remote. And to your point, learning, just, off the cuff learning and being able to ask the person who sits next to you, "Hey, have you done this? Could you help me?" So,
I'm just thinking about my time starting at Cohen in public accounting and shout out Matt Shalmo for, all the times I would go over and just hover over his
mhm.
cube like, "Hey, man, I have a quick question on this," and then that turns into, like, 30 minutes.
Exactly, you learn a lot, and it doesn't have to be, the ultimate boss. It can be, somebody who's just a year ahead of you, who's
Yeah.
seeing what you're working on.
Yeah. Could be even the same level, who's just could be that
Exactly.
another same level person who's gotten that experience,
Right,
quicker, ran into something like that. Uh,
right.
it's interesting. We'll see, where we go from here. Early 2025, so you never know where we go. With along those lines of kind of learning and staying up to date, how do you keep up on the industries that you're in, and how do you keep your skills sharp?
Well, from an accounting and finance perspective, I do like to do, the Big 4 always does their quarterly updates, and they publish papers when, new ASBs come out, right? So,
Yeah.
trying to stay abreast of that, but, I also have an accounting husband, so, if I have a question, I can usually ask.
It's a cheat code.
That's cheating.
Yeah.
But he is, I've taken a much more finance path, whereas he's taken a much more accounting and controlling path. So if I have a more technical question, I can actually ask him. Like I mean, obviously I know accounting, but not
Right.
to the depth of knowledge that he has. That's his job.
Yeah. That's a smart business choice right there. That's a good business match.
Yeah. But as far as industries, when I was at RPM for 20 years, so a lot of it just came with being around everyone, that knowledge kind of grew naturally. But then being an FP&A, obviously I was looking at industry trends and trying to understand, at RPM, the portfolio is relatively balanced in that we have more industrial facing companies versus consumer.
Okay.
They, sorry.
Yeah.
We'll
That's all
have
right.
it side where it was 20 years.
Yeah.
And so, when you would see a recession coming, the consumer business would start to drop off, but the, industrial side of the business would keep going because it has to be really bad for them to stop projects that are in process, on,
Okay.
in building sites or, oil rigs, things like that, right? Those projects don't necessarily stop. They finish and new ones might not start.
Yeah.
But then on the flip side, when you're coming out, you can tell because the consumer side starts to pick up first. And
That
so, that just comes with years of experience in, watching housing trends and, and honestly, like listening to or reading our customers, you know, press releases and cues to kind of see what they're doing and what they're seeing.
yeah. So really just anywhere in the industry that you can get that information, kinda just kinda keeping those tabs on.
Mhm. Yeah,
Okay.
it's. looking at competitors also, obviously, but,
Yeah.
customers, I think, is a good base to see what they're saying and their expectations are for the future because that ultimately is
Yeah.
what's gonna impact you.
Yeah. For the public clients that we work with, that is something that I love to do is just love to do per se, but enjoy
It's
doing.
part of the job, yes.
Cracking open a K and kind of keeping up with the reports they have coming out throughout the year, to really, because we're having the conversation, sometimes we don't get to keep as up to date as much as we'd like, but obviously they're putting a lot of time and effort and thought into putting those reports together. I think it makes a lot of sense to kind of just sit down and read a little bit about what they're seeing, from that team there. Now,
And their earnings releases, like, the earnings release calls tend to be
yeah,
really interesting too because the
yeah,
analysts ask kind of leading questions to, you know, get them to answer things that aren't necessarily in, a Q or a K.
yeah. And they like to ask those controversial questions, which is just good for
And it's
entertainment.
fun to listen to how people respond to, to the not to give the
Yeah,
non-answer. Hey,
yeah.
you know what? But reading cues is a great way to put yourself that would be nonfiction reading that would probably put you to sleep.
That's after cup number 2 when I'm in, like, hyperdrive mode, cup number 2 of coffee, 'cause that's a lot of technical reading to be had there.
Yes, it
That's
is.
fun. So you mentioned, you like fishing before bed. Any business books that have had a unique impact on you?
Well, one that I really loved and one of my leaders in Europe gave it to me. It's called The Culture Map by Aaron
Culture
Meyer.
Map.
It was really interesting for me going in as an American, uh, and to be honest, an American woman too, because,
Mm,
you know, it does make a difference sometimes.
yeah.
But it was all about how different cultures perceive and want to receive information that is handed to them so that they can best it was fantastic. He gave it to me when he heard that I was taking over the role in Germany,
Mm,
and it was probably the best reading I ever had for working in a multicultural environment because
yeah.
people tend to think, oh, the Europeans, they're just like us. Well, they are most definitely not just like us in how they want to receive and digest information. So it was, and it helped me learn, pace of change
Yeah.
sometimes doesn't happen in the way that Americans would people from the US would like it to happen, but if you want to have lasting change, you have to sometimes step back, take your time, let the reactions, which can sometimes be explosive, happen, and then let them come back and ask more questions later without taking it too personally.
That's so interesting. What a cool book. So it
Yeah, it
has
was
it has of all the different cultures. Uh,
yeah, a major but I mean, it even pointed out, the difference between European cultures, right? The French are very different than the Brits, things like
yeah.
that. So, uh,
Okay.
it was that to me was one of my most transformative, to be honest.
I mean, what a perfect recommendation, perfect timing on that. I'll have
Yeah.
to add that to the list because it sounds very interesting. So, when it comes to, because this is something you probably would have dealt with when you were over there, is when you're building your teams, right? Your accounting finance teams, what's kind of your approach?
Well, I mean, as I said, technical competence is obviously the base for everything,
Kind of
but
assumed.
yes,
Yeah.
that's the assumption, but I think cultural fit and also it at some level, personality fit matters as well,
Yeah.
right? Because you spend more time with the people that you work with than you do your family members, if you think about it, really. I mean,
Yeah. 100%.
um, so you want to be around people that are not only competent, but are able to fit into and adapt to the culture. Because, I spent so long at RPM, I will admit it was a bit of a culture shock going to Avery, just, because
Yeah.
it's really different.
Yeah.
Not good, not bad, just different.
It's different. Yeah.
And so that is important, trying to find somebody who's adaptable, particularly if they've spent, a long time at one company. And and again, somebody who again is somebody who would want to spend time around, to be honest.
Yeah. So kind of pleasant. It's
Yes.
how, yeah. So underlying technical competence, ability to be adaptable when certain
Mhm.
situations pop up, and then just a general good undertone personality, right? Like something
Yes.
that you have, like you said, you're spending a ton of time with this person.
And when I don't wanna say outgoing or anything, it's more just somebody
Right.
that is willing to challenge things, but in a way that doesn't, become off-putting, right?
Right. I think that's one thing that I definitely see quite a bit, which is, especially as you climb the ladder a little more, is this person going to have the ability to question the way that things are, but in a way where, like, you're not just questioning it to question it. You are looking at something and asking, is there a better way to do this? Or have we considered XYZ? Like, would it make it more efficient? Would it make it easier for our team members? And like, when you don't have that, I think especially as you get into these senior level finance roles, it's hard for company leaders to kind of consider you because you have to have that ability to ask questions, ask tough questions, I should say.
Yes, and I've found personally that, because you can often look at a situation and say, "Why the heck are they doing it that way?"
Yeah.
And this is what I think they should do. And, maybe that's the most efficient way. But again, going back to getting people to come along with you and be on board with the change, I like to
Yeah.
spend the time understanding why. I mean, obviously, this process or whatever was developed or came about for a reason. Why is that?
Yeah.
And that leads to and then you can ask the questions of, what makes this difficult? How would you improve it if you could? And sometimes it leads people to their own, realization that, oh, if we can change it, I would love if we could change this.
Yeah. So when you look at your goals and plans for a year, how do you balance short-term goals and results with the long-term strategic planning? Because I feel like this is a tough problem to deal with.
Yes, particularly at publicly traded companies, let's be honest.
Exactly, yeah.
So I think that it's really important when you are in your annual operating plan meetings, right? Where you are deciding how budgets are going to be allocated, what money is going to be spent, to make sure that you understand which spending you have built in that is related to a long-term plan.
Mm,
And also work with the leaders of the business to say, if we have to pause this, what is the impact? Like, what if we pause spending for 3, 6 months? What will be the long term ramifications of that? And then going in knowing, these are the projects that are the sacred cows that cannot be touched, right? Versus the ones that perhaps we could pause with less of a long term impact. So I think that's the most
mm,
important thing is really knowing and understanding what those spending needs are and the impact of delaying if you need to. And also, sometimes things are going great. You can also accelerate as well, right? Doesn't
yeah.
happen nearly as often as the breaking, but
Yeah,
um, it's really knowing which projects, especially in a big portfolio of businesses, which are the projects that are most vital to the overall company's growth long
mhm,
term strategically. Because RPM, obviously it's very decentralized. Every business thinks their project is the most important, right? And to
sure.
them, to be fair, it
Yeah,
is. So it's really learning to balance what is the most important and has the most future potential impact for the entire organization, not just the individual units.
got it, okay. And are this I'm curious, do you have any project management tools that you use to keep track of everything going on, or anything that you've used in the past from a technology standpoint that you really like?
No, RPM didn't really have a project management
Okay.
tracking tool, at least when I was there. So I don't know,
Okay.
if they do now, they may very well.
Yeah.
And at Avery, any of the long-term strategic plans were managed by the strategy office, so I don't. really know, to be honest.
So how do you keep your personal like what's your personal organization like? What do you kind of what's your organizational system, I guess?
Well, I am in it's funny, I fill up notebooks full of notes. I very
Yeah.
rarely actually refer to them, but the act of actually writing something down helps me remember it.
Yeah.
So, everyone's like, "Man, you take so many notes." I'm like, "Yeah, that act of writing it down helps me remember." And, like, I can later say, "Oh, I remember the meeting that it was in," and can kind of actually picture where in the notebook it is. So it
Yeah.
kind of helps me. That's just, I guess, how my memory works. The act of writing it down actually helps me.
It's so funny because you're like trying to make sure you catch everything and write it all down. And then it's like, I didn't even need to write it down. I remember it all. I remember it all now that I wrote it down.
Exactly. Yeah, I'm not gonna test the theory now because I'm too far in to test a theory for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, final question for you, Melissa. What advice would you give to any aspiring financial leaders listening right now?
I would say first and foremost, as we talked about, really develop relationships, not just within the financial team, but across the organization, because that will help you gain visibility throughout the organization, not just within the finance structure. And having those relationships and support from outside, I think really helped a lot in my advancement because, as I said at RPM, I came up through finance and then I came back in working for the COO, not in the finance department. So I really think that's important. And, to that, go into the office once in a while if you can, right? Meet your coworkers in person and have it be more than just a working relationship because it
Yeah.
really does matter when people say, ask how your kids are and they know them and, they know the sports they're in. It makes a difference, I think.
Yeah.
Or their
So,
pets. I've got 4 dogs too, so there's a
Mark.
no shortage of things to ask me about.
Yeah. So be intentional about kind of making an impact sort of within the company that you're in, being known.
Yes, I think that, again, back to the whole hybrid remote in office, I think it will hinder especially finance people's abilities to move forward because I think in sales and marketing, you're kind of out there more inherently just in the type of position they are.
Yeah.
And I think it's really important for finance people to put themselves out there and, expand beyond just their narrow scope.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. Well, this was awesome, Melissa. I appreciate you carving out the time here, and I look forward to getting this out there.
All right, great. Thank you, Alec.